Let's create a completely legitimate pirate using our completely legitimate copy of Photoshop. I'm Abby Sparza. I've been creating composites for around 10 years now, and I have paid for Photoshop for about as long. All the resources featured here today can be found over on Envato Elements, where you get unlimited downloads of graphics, photos, and fonts, all with super simple commercial licensing. Now, onto the pirating. So I already went ahead and whipped up a piratey inspired background, flag, and all. If you want to recreate the background step by step, check out the written version of this tutorial down in the description. We do have a quick, non-destructive color grade to build. This color grade will consist of 5 adjustment layers grouped together and placed right at the top of our layer stack, so all future layers will be created underneath this group. I'm going to place in my pirate subject, which I already extracted using the pen tool, but you can use whatever method you prefer. For the actual color grade, let's start with a color lookup adjustment layer, set to teal orange plus contrast, with an opacity of 30%. Then a second color lookup layer, set to film stock at 20%. Next up, a selective color adjustment layer with the settings seen here. Again, you can see the exact settings in the written version of the tutorial. That might be easier to read, or you can just pause. Also works as well. And then a third color lookup layer, set to edgy amber at 20%. And finally, one last color lookup layer, set to drop blues at 50% opacity and a layer mode set to color. We're going to go ahead and collapse the group once we're done, and you can even lock it so it stays out of your way. Again, this will be at the top of our layer stack from here on out. And with the colors figured out and our subject placed, we can start adding in some shadows and highlights, starting with adding a super quick rim light effect. First, duplicate the subject, bringing the duplicate below the original. Add an orange color overlay. And then let's enlarge and warp that duplicate, so there is an uneven rim of orange around the subject. We don't want the light to be perfectly even. In fact, let's add a layer mask to the rim light layer and mask out portions of the rim so that it tapers off in certain places and is completely hidden in others. This is a very stylistic effect, so it doesn't have to be overly accurate, but kind of just think about where light would be shining through the strongest. And once you're happy with your layer mask, you can right-click Rasterize Layer Effect, and then change the layer mode to screen or color dodge, whichever looks best to you. Now let's start building some inner lighting by applying an inner glow layer style to the subject. I'm using the same orange as before, set to color dodge, and you can see my exact settings. Though always feel free to play around with settings, they never really need to be exact. And that'll give us a good base to start with, but let's also hand paint some more light around the subject's edges. First, create and clip a new layer set to color dodge into the subject, and then using a soft round brush, let's paint with that same orange color. Focus on the edges of the subject, but bring and taper the light inwards as well. Setting your brush to a low flow will help you build the light up slowly and give you nice, smooth transitions. And you can always lower your layer's opacity if the effect is a little too harsh. And then we can finish up that rim lighting by adding some highlights to the beard area. Go ahead and create and clip a new layer into the subject and set it to screen. Now you could individually paint in stubbly hair, tapering the edges of the subject's face using a hard round brush. But I recommend creating a super easy hair stubble brush by creating a new canvas and drawing a few hair-like lines, kind of like what you see here. It does not need to be exact. And then you go to Edit Define Brush Preset, and then set the brush settings to what you see here. Now, don't forget to save the brush after applying these settings, otherwise you'll be stuck reapplying those settings every time you switch brushes. And with that new stubble brush, we can paint in our hairs much quicker using the same orange as before. And let's finish up this lighting by adding some shadows. Create and clip a solid colorful layer into the subject and set it to a darkish blue color. Next, set the layer mode to multiply. Multiply is a great layer mode for shadows. And then we want to bring the opacity down to 70%. Though feel free to change that later on. Let's double click the layer to open the layer style panel and adjust the blend if to remove the shadows from the highlights. Hold Alt to split the toggles and recreate something similar to what you see here. Again, doesn't need to be exact. Just play around until you have a good mix of shadows to highlights. With that shadow layer prepped and ready, we can invert the layer mask using Ctrl-I, filling the layer mask with black. And then mask in some shadows using a plain old default round brush at different sizes and softness. Focus on the inner parts of the subject and places like the smile lines, the neck area, and other shadowy areas. You can also use this layer to start bringing in things like dark under eyes or dirty patches of skin. He's a pirate after all. Our pirate is all lit up and ready to go, but we still need to add some more piratey details, I think. Starting with some gold teeth, my favorite detail. Let's create and clip a gradient adjustment layer into the subject, right above the shadow layer. Now replicate the gradient you see here. The colors and placements of the toggles don't have to be perfect. Depending on your subject, you may need to adjust them anyway, but this is a good starting point for gold-inspired gradients in general. So I do highly suggest saving it as a preset by using the New button once you're done setting it all up. Again, to save you some time in the future. With the gradient all set up, let's fill its layer mask with black using Ctrl-I, and then mask in the gold on some of the teeth using a semi-hard round brush. We can also add some gold accents to the buttons and guns, because pirates do love gold. And we can really make those teeth shine by adding a few golden sparkles on a new layer set to screen. I have a 6-point star brush that I like to use, but you can use any sparkly brush you might have. Even a simple, soft light bloom will work perfectly fine. Now let's move on to the pirate hat, because every pirate needs a big fancy hat. Let's select the current hat using the lasso tool. The selection does not have to be perfect since most of the hat is already extracted. Copy and paste the hat onto a new layer, and let's right-click Convert to Smart Object so we can resize the hat without having to worry about too much pixel deterioration. Because we're going to enlarge the hat as much as we can before it starts to become noticeably blurry. And if it starts to look too pixelated, you can then shrink it back down and not have to worry about too much fuzziness, thanks to turning it into a smart object. And then we can add a layer mask to the hat and mask any harsh edges, blending the larger hat into the original hat. We'll also need to add a quick rim light to the new hat using the same method as before. And we can finish off the hat by placing an image of a big old white feather on a black background behind the subject, setting that layer to screen. Since the background on this feather isn't solid black, we can add some quick masking using a default round brush. We don't have to be overly careful while masking though, since we'll add some final sparks that hide a lot of the extra feathers. Now we still have a few more pirate details to go, like an eye patch. Start by creating the basic shape of your eye patch using either a solid hard round brush or the pen tool. Then we're going to clip an image of some cloth into that shape. Now we have to do some color correcting to that cloth. So first, let's start with image adjustments curves, bringing up the shadows but darkening the highlights. This will create a really dark matte-like cloth. And secondly, an image adjustments color balance set to -26, 0, and +21 to bring in a slight blue tint. And then we can finish that eye patch off by adding both shadows and highlights using layers set to soft light and multiply. I used one layer clipped into the eye patch to add some shape to the edges of the eye patch, highlight the middle portion, and darken the parts closest to the hat. Then a second soft light layer above the hat, a layer to darken the forehead area and bring some of the shadows that the hat would be casting onto the eye patch. And finally, I painted in a simple shadow under the eye patch using a multiply layer with kind of a darker brown color. You may end up using more or fewer layers, just use as many as you need. And I almost forgot, we have to add some greasy, piratey makeup. So let's create 2 adjustment layers underneath the eye patch layers. A black and white gradient map, and then a brightness contrast layer set to -150 brightness, and 66 contrast. Then we want to go into the layer style panel of the brightness contrast layer and remove the highlights. Try and replicate something like you see here. Again, no need to be exact. It's going to look pretty harsh and crispy for a moment. Because we're going to group those 2 adjustment layers together and add a layer mask to that group, and then invert the mask using Ctrl-I, which will fill it with black and hiding it. And then we can use a semi-soft round brush to paint in eyeshadow grease and dirt around the eye's face, and you can even bring it onto the teeth for a grimy tooth effect. Now let's give these guns a bit more spark. Place an image of embers or sparks behind the guns, setting that layer to screen. Let's add a bunch of contrast to the sparks using image adjustments brightness contrast, setting that contrast to 100. This will help separate the sparks from their original background. And then we can mask out any remaining background using a soft round brush. You can get away with using those same sparks for the second gun, just duplicate and flip them horizontally and try and mask out any details that look a little too repetitive. Repeat the same steps to add some more floaty-like sparks to both the foreground and background. And we can finish up by bringing in a second super enlarged portion of the pirate flag to the foreground of the image, again to add a bit more depth, blurring it so it looks slightly out of focus. And that is how we pirate Photoshop. If that wasn't enough and you're looking to learn even more, why not check out some of the other videos that Envato Tuts Plus has to offer. If you liked this video, consider giving us a like and even subscribing if you haven't already, and don't forget to click the little bell icon to be notified of all new videos including tips, tricks, and of course tutorials. Happy pirating, see you next time.